they didn't leave because you were wrong. That's the first illusion you have to break. Because if you don't, you'll spend months, sometimes years, trying to fix a version of yourself that was never the problem to begin with. What actually happened is much more uncomfortable and much more revealing. The connection became real, not surface level attraction, not casual interaction, but something deeper, something that required presence, something that asked them to be emotionally available. They consistent and seen. And for an avoidant, that's not just unfamiliar, it's threatening. You have to understand how they're wired. Avoidant individuals often learned early on that closeness comes with a cost. Maybe it was inconsistency. Maybe it was emotional neglect. Maybe it was being made to feel that their needs were too much, so they adapted. They built a system where independence equals safety and emotional distance equals control. That system works until they meet someone who bypasses it, that someone was you, because you didn't just interact with them, you reached them. You created moments where they felt understood without having to explain themselves. You offered consistency in a way they didn't know how to reciprocate. And for a while, it felt good. It felt exciting. It even felt safe until it didn't. Because the deeper the connection went, the more it challenged their internal programming. Real intimacy doesn't just give, it asks. It asks for vulnerability. It asks for accountability. It asks for emotional risk. And when those demands started to rise, something inside them activated. Not clarity, not communication, fear. So what do they do with that fear? They don't sit with it. They don't articulate it. They don't come to you and say, this is overwhelming for me and I don't know how to handle it. That level of self-awareness and emotional expression requires work they haven't done yet. Instead, they default to the only strategy that's ever made them feel safe. They create distance. And from your perspective, it feels sudden, confusing, almost like a switch flipped overnight. One moment there's connection, presence, even affection, and the next, there's silence, withdrawal, or emotional coldness. And your mind tries to make sense of it in the only way it knows how, by turning inward and asking, what did I do wrong? But that question is built on a false premise, because what pushed them away wasn't something you did incorrectly. It was something you did effectively. You made the connection real enough that it required them to step beyond their emotional comfort zone. And instead of expanding, they retreated. That's the paradox of avoidant behavior. The very thing they crave, genuine connection, is the same thing that destabilizes them when it actually shows up. So they move away from it, not because it lacks value, but because it carries weight they don't yet know how to hold. And if you don't understand this, you'll misinterpret their departure as rejection of your worth rather than recognition of their limitations. So the truth is simple, but not easy to accept. They didn't leave because you weren't enough. They left because what you offered required them to become someone they're not yet ready to be. And until that changes, no amount of proving, chasing, or adjusting will make them stay. Because you didn't lose them by doing something wrong. You revealed something they weren't ready to face. Now, while you're sitting with the aftermath replaying conversations, analyzing details, trying to extract meaning from what happened, they are doing something very different. They are not processing the pain in the way you are. They are escaping it. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because when you're wired for connection, your instinct is to move toward the discomfort. You reflect, you feel, you try to understand. You ask questions like, what went wrong? Or what could I have done differently? That's how you create closure. That's how you grow. But avoidants operate on a completely different internal system. For them, emotional discomfort doesn't signal an invitation to go deeper, it signals danger. So instead of turning toward the pain, they turn away from it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. They distract themselves, they immerse in work routines or surface level interactions. They convince themselves they're fine, that it wasn't that serious, or that it's better this way. And on the outside, it can look like they've moved on effortlessly. No visible grief, no visible struggle, just distance and silence. And that's the part that hurts you the most, because it feels like the connection meant more to you than it ever did to them. But here's where you have to be very precise in your understanding. Just because someone avoids their emotions doesn't mean they don't have them. It means they don't have the capacity or the willingness to sit with them. Suppressed. Emotion doesn't disappear. It gets stored. It gets redirected. It leaks out in subtle ways in restlessness, in irritability, in an ongoing sense that something is unresolved. But because they've trained themselves not to engage with it consciously, they rarely connect those internal signals back to you or to what happened between you. So while you're processing the loss directly, they're carrying it indirectly. And that creates a kind of emotional asymmetry. You're doing the visible. Work feeling, reflecting, integrating while they're maintaining the illusion of control by staying disconnected. But control and resolution are not the same thing. Avoidance can create temporary relief, but it doesn't create closure. In fact, it often does the opposite. It prolongs the internal tension. Because the truth is, when you walk away from something meaningful without understanding it, without owning your part in it, without allowing yourself to fully feel it too, don't actually move on. You just postpone the experience. You push it into the background where it quietly waits. And over time, those unprocessed experiences accumulate. They shape patterns. They reinforce the belief that closeness leads to discomfort, that vulnerability leads to overwhelm. So the next time something real shows up, the reaction is even faster, even more automatic. That's why avoidants don't just avoid you, they avoid the emotional reality that you represent. And if you're not careful, you'll misread their silence as indifference, when in reality, it's a strategy. A learned, deeply ingrained strategy to stay functional without having to feel too much, too deeply for too long. But here's the cost of that strategy. When you escape pain, you also limit your capacity for depth. You don't just avoid hurt, you avoid growth, connection, and emotional expansion. And that's the trade-off they're making, whether they're conscious of it or not. So while it may look like they've taken the easier path, what they've actually done is choose short-term comfort over long-term clarity. And that leaves you with a realization that can be difficult, but ultimately freeing. You're not dealing with someone who didn't feel, you're dealing with someone who didn't stay. And there's a profound difference between the two, because one speaks to your worth and the other speaks to their capacity. And this is where the situation becomes even more misleading, because from the outside, their silence can look like peace. It can look like they've made a clean decision, close the chapter, and move forward without hesitation. No messages, no explanations, no visible struggle, just absence. But silence is not always a sign of clarity. Very often it's a sign of conflict that hasn't been resolved. Because internally what's happening is not a calm resolution, it's a push and pull between two opposing forces. One part of them remembers what they felt with you, the ease, the connection, the sense of being. They understood without effort. That part doesn't disappear just because they created distance. It stays active, even if it's not expressed. But there's another part of them that's just as strong, if not stronger, the part that associates closeness with risk. The part that says, if this continues, I'm going to lose control. I'm going to be expected to show up in ways I don't know how to sustain. I'm going to have to deal with emotions I've spent years avoiding. So now they're caught between desire and defense, between wanting the connection and fearing the responsibility that comes with it. And when those two forces collide, silence becomes the default response. Not because it solves anything, but because it postpones everything. You have to understand communication requires alignment. It requires a level of internal clarity where someone can say, this is what I feel, this is what I want, and this is what I'm capable of giving. But when someone is internally divided, they don't have access to that clarity. So instead of communicating something incomplete or uncomfortable, they say nothing at all. And from your side, that silence feels like an answer. It feels like rejection. It feels like a statement about your value. But it's not a statement, it's an absence of one. Because if they were truly at peace with the decision, there would be congruence. Their actions, their emotions, and their communication would align. There would be closure, even if it was difficult to hear. But when there's silence, it often means something is still unresolved beneath the surface. The problem is, unresolved doesn't mean actionable. Just because they're internally conflicted doesn't mean they're going to resolve that conflict in a way that benefits you. In many cases, they won't. They'll stay in that in-between space, missing the connection at times, but not enough to override the fear that made them leave in the first place. And that creates one of the most frustrating dynamics you can experience, because you're left trying to interpret something that was never clearly expressed. You're filling in gaps, creating narratives, searching for meaning and behavior that was driven more by avoidance than intention. But there's a critical shift that has to happen here. You have to stop treating their silence as something you need to decode and start recognizing it for what it is, a reflection of their internal state, not a roadmap for your decisions. Because if you base your next move, on their inconsistency, you anchor yourself to their confusion. And that keeps you stuck in a loop where you're waiting for clarity from someone who doesn't have it to give. Silence in this context is not closure, but it is information. It tells you that they are not currently operating from a place of alignment, and that alone has consequences for what they can offer you. Not hypothetically, not in the future, but right now. And when you begin to see it that way, something shifts. You stop chasing explanations and start recognizing patterns. You stop personalizing their absence and start understanding their limitations. Because at the end of the day, their silence isn't peace, it's pressure they haven't learned how to release. And if someone can't face their own internal conflict, they will never be able to show up consistently in yours. And this leads to something even more confronting, because at a certain point, it's no longer just about their fear of intimacy. It becomes about their fear of you specifically. Not because you're threatening in any obvious way, but because of what you represent to them on a deeper psychological level. You become a mirror, not the kind that reflects surface level traits, but the kind that reflects emotional truth, the version of themselves that showed up with you open, engaged. Present is not easy for them to reconcile with the identity they've built around being self-sufficient and unaffected. With you, that identity cracked. And once someone has seen themselves outside of their usual defenses, it's very difficult to go back without discomfort. So when they think about facing you again, it's not just about the conversation. It's about the confrontation with that version of themselves they don't fully understand. The one who felt deeply, the one who allowed connection to matter, the one who in some way lost control. And for someone who equates control with safety, that's destabilizing, because now being in your presence doesn't just bring back memories, it brings back awareness. Awareness of how they showed up, awareness of what they couldn't sustain, awareness of the gap between what they felt and what they were capable of maintaining. And that gap is where discomfort lives. Most people assume that if someone disappears, it's because they don't care enough to stay. But in many avoidant dynamics, the opposite can be closer to the truth. The more significant the connection, the more intense the reflection, and stronger the urge to avoid it. It's not indifference, it's exposure. Because you saw them in a way they didn't even see themselves. You responded to parts of them that were real but underdeveloped. And once those parts were activated, they couldn't simply be ignored. They had to be either integrated or avoided. And integration requires work. It requires sitting with uncomfortable truths, acknowledging emotional limitations, and taking responsibility for how those limitations affect others. That's a level of internal accountability that many avoidants haven't built yet. So instead, they choose distance, not because distance resolves anything, but because it reduces the intensity of the reflection. The further they are from you, the easier it is to return to a version of themselves that feels more familiar, more controlled, more predictable. But that doesn't mean the reflection disappears. It just becomes less immediate. And this is why, if they do come back at some point, it often feels inconsistent, Because the part of them that was activated by you never fully shuts off, it just goes dormant until something triggers it again. A memory, a feeling, a moment of loneliness or clarity, and suddenly the same internal tension resurfaces. But here's the key point you have to understand. Their inability to face you is not a measure of your intensity, it's a measure of their avoidance. You didn't do something wrong by being present, by being open, by creating a space where something real could exist. What you did was remove the distance they rely on to stay emotionally regulated. And without that distance, they were exposed to a level of emotional reality they weren't prepared to manage. So they did what they've always done. When that happens, they stepped back. And from your perspective, that step back feels like rejection. It feels like they're choosing not to engage, not to care, not to show up. But from their perspective, it's an attempt to regain equilibrium, to return to a state where they feel less vulnerable, less dependent, less at risk. That doesn't make it right, but it does make it understandable. And when you begin to see it through that lens, something shifts internally. You stop asking, why am I too much? And start asking, why is authenticity too much for them to hold? Because at the end of the day, you didn't overwhelm them by being excessive. You revealed something they've spent years trying not to see. And not everyone is ready to face own reflection, especially when it asks them to grow. And when you step back and look at the pattern as a whole, a deeper contradiction starts to emerge. Because despite the distance, despite the silence, despite the inconsistency, there is still a part of them that wants connection. That hasn't disappeared. It hasn't been erased. It's still there, operating beneath the surface. But the form of connection they want is very specific. They want closeness without pressure. They want emotional safety without emotional exposure. They want to feel understood, supported, even cared for, but without being required to consistently show up in the same way. In other words, they want the benefits of intimacy without the responsibilities that make intimacy real. And that's not because they're intentionally trying to take more than they give. It's because psychologically, that's the only version of connection that feels manageable to them. You have to understand, for someone who vulnerability with risk, emotional responsibility doesn't feel like growth, it feels like potential loss. Loss of independence, loss of control, loss of identity. So even when they genuinely feel something for you, even when they miss you or think about you, there's a limit to how far they can go before that internal alarm system activates again. And when it does, they pull back not because the feeling disappeared, but because the cost of expressing it feels too high. This is where a lot of people get caught in a loop because you can sense that they care. You can see glimpses of it in the way they show up occasionally, in the moments where they soften, in the subtle ways they reconnect. And those moments feel real because they are real, but they're incomplete because consistency requires capacity. And capacity is built through self-awareness, emotional regulation, and a willingness to stay present even when things feel uncomfortable. Without those elements, what you get, intermittent connection just enough to keep the bond alive, but not enough to make it stable. And that intermittent dynamic can be incredibly powerful. It creates hope. It creates anticipation. It makes you believe that if you just adjust a little more, understand a little better, give a little more space, eventually things will align. But alignment doesn't come from effort alone, it comes from readiness. And readiness is something they have to develop internally. It's not something you can. They create for them by being more patient, more understanding, or more available. Because the truth is, you can meet someone at their depth, but you can't expand their depth for them. So what they end up wanting often, without fully realizing it is a version of you that stays connected without asking for more. A version of the relationship that doesn't challenge their limits, doesn't confront their patterns, doesn't require them to evolve. But that version of connection comes at a cost. And the cost, dig, is mutual growth, mutual effort, and emotional reciprocity. So now the question becomes not what they want, but what you're willing to accept. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. You recognize that the issue isn't a lack of feeling, it's a lack of sustainability. It's not about whether the connection exists, but whether it can be maintained in a way that's healthy, consistent, and real. And if someone wants you in a way that avoids those requirements, then what they're really asking for is access without accountability. And that's not connection, that's convenience. So you have to decide whether you're willing to stay in something that feels meaningful in moments but unstable over time. Whether you're willing to accept a version of love that shows up when it's easy but disappears when it's required. Because at some point, clarity replaces confusion. And when it does, the question is no longer do they care? It becomes, are they capable of loving me in a way? That I can actually live with. And if the answer to that is no, then no amount of desire on their part will change what the reality requires. And this brings everything into focus, because what looks like an ending is often something very different when you're dealing with an avoidant pattern. Their disappearance can feel final. It can feel like a closed door, like a decision that's been made with certainty. But in many cases, it's not a conclusion, it's a defense mechanism. Distance, for them, is regulation. It's how they calm the internal intensity that the connection created. When things start to feel too real, too demanding, too emotionally charged, they don't resolve it, they step away from it. And once that intensity drops, something interesting begins to happen. They start to feel again, but this time, without the immediate pressure, because now you're not there in real time. There are no expectations, no conversations that require depth, no moments that demand vulnerability. And in that space, the emotional side of the connection can resurface in a way that feels safer to them. They can remember you without having to respond to you. They can miss you without having to show up for you. And this is where the cycle often resets. At some point, maybe weeks later, maybe months later, they reach out. It might be subtle, casual, almost as if nothing significant ever happened. And for you, that moment can feel like confirmation. Like everything you felt wasn't one-sided. Like there's finally an opportunity to pick up where things left off. But this is where clarity becomes critical, because their return is not automatically a sign of growth. It's often a sign that the emotional intensity has become manageable again. The same connection that once overwhelmed them now feels distant enough to re-engage with on their terms. And if nothing has fundamentally changed within them, no increased self-awareness, no work on their emotional patterns, no real shift in how they handle closeness, then the outcome will follow the same trajectory. It might start strong again. It might even feel deeper because there's a history now. But eventually, the same pressure points will be reached and the same defense mechanisms will activate. Not because the connection isn't real, but because their capacity hasn't expanded. This is where a lot of people get pulled back into a loop, because the return feels meaningful. It feels intentional. And part of you wants to believe that. This time will be different. That maybe the distance changed them. That maybe they realized what they lost. But realization without transformation doesn't create a new pattern that recreates the old one. So the question you have to ask is not whether they came back, but why they came back, and more importantly, what's different this time? Are they showing up with more consistency, more openness, more willingness to engage with discomfort instead of avoiding it? Or are they simply reconnecting in a way that feels good in the moment without addressing what made them leave in the first place? Because if it's the second, then what you're seeing is not a new chapter, it's a continuation. And this is where your awareness becomes your responsibility. You can't control whether they return. You can't control how they feel or when they decide to reach out. But you can control how you interpret that return and what you choose to do with it. Because when you understand that their disappearance was defense, not a resolution, you stop romanticizing the comeback. You stop assigning meaning to their reappearance that isn't supported by real change. And instead, you start asking a different question. Not do they want me, but are they ready to meet me where I am? Because wanting is easy. Returning is easy. What's difficult and what actually matters is staying, growing, and showing up differently than before. And if that hasn't changed, then the pattern hasn't changed. It's just repeating in a new moment. So the most powerful shift you can make is this: Stop measuring their interest by their presence and start measuring their growth by their consistency. Because at the end of the day, a temporary return doesn't rewrite the story it reveals, whether a new one is even possible. And if nothing has changed beneath the surface, then their disappearance was never the end. It was just the beginning of a cycle you now have the awareness to break. So when you step back and look at the entire dynamic, everything you felt, everything they showed, and everything they couldn't sustain, a different kind of clarity begins to form. This was never just about them hurting you and disappearing. It was about what that disappearance revealed. It revealed that connection alone is not enough. That intensity is not the same as stability. That someone can feel deeply for you and still not be capable of showing up in a way that protects, supports, and sustains that connection over time. And that's the part most people struggle to accept, because it's easier to believe that if the feeling was real, then the outcome should have been different. That if there was chemistry, understanding, and emotional depth, then it should have led somewhere solid. But relationships are not built on feeling alone, they are built on capacity, on emotional availability, on the willingness to stay present when things stop being easy. And what you experienced was someone who reached a point where feeling was no longer the issue. Responsibility was. They didn't disappear because you lacked something. They disappeared because the relationship required something they weren't ready to give. And once you truly understand that, something shifts inside you. You stop chasing explanations. You stop replaying moments, trying to decode where it went wrong. You stop measuring your worth based on their inconsistency, because you see the pattern for what it is, not a reflection of your value, but a reflection of theirs. Limits. And that awareness gives you something powerful. Choice. The choice to stop waiting for someone to become ready. The choice to stop accepting partial connection as if it's complete. The choice to recognize that love in its healthiest form is not confusing, not inconsistent, and not something you have to earn by minimizing your own needs. Because the truth is, you can understand someone deeply and still choose not to stay. You can have compassion for their fears without making those. Fear's your responsibility. You can acknowledge what was real without ignoring what was missing. And that's where real growth happens, not in trying to fix the dynamic, but in outgrowing the need to. So if they come back, you'll see them clearly. If they don't, you'll still have your clarity. Because you're no longer looking for answers from someone who couldn't give them. You've already found them within your own understanding. And that's the shift that changes everything. Not when they return, not when they explain, but when you no longer need them to. Because at the end of the day, the most important question was never, why did they leave? It was always, why would you stay where you're not fully met? And once you answer that honestly, you don't just understand the situation, you rise above it.